Euphrasie Barbier. Chapter 6, 1864, The First Mission. 1867. For nearly 6 years, Euphrasie's congregation had prospered spiritually, though they were always short of money. She often felt now that her duties as Superior General were taking her away from the mother house too often. She appointed a new novice mistress, Sister Mary of the Blessed Sacrament, who had only recently been professed as a sister of Our Lady of the Missions, but who had lived devoutly for some years in another religious community. Now, Euphrasie thought, I can work at fundraising and at writing the constitutions without neglecting the guidance of the young sisters. She thought again of the constitutions. In them was a clause which limited any superior's term of office to 6 years. My 6 years of leadership will finish in August, she thought. I must retire then. I am so tired. I would be glad to have no more responsibilities, to be free to pray whenever I like. Yes, I shall retire from leadership. But who could carry on what I have started? Responsibility, failure, holding on, letting go. Was that the choice before her? She swayed from one to the other. No, it is a temptation, she said, to think that God's work depends on me alone. I have warned the sisters about this trap, and now I am falling into it myself. We have just written this important clause into the constitutions. How could I, the first office holder, give such bad example to all those following? If I do not keep the rules myself, how can I ask anyone else to? Or am I shirking my responsibility, trying to escape from the burden of duty under pretence of virtue? Is there another sister experienced enough yet to foster the spirit of our vocation? Holding on, letting go, opting out. She could not decide. She reminded the sisters in her council and announced to Father Favre that according to the constitutions it was now time to prepare for the 6-yearly general chapter of the congregation. She told them also her reasons for wanting to resign and warned them that they would soon have serious decisions to make for the future. Before retiring, Euphrasie had much to do in preparation for the chapter meetings, as well as her usual tasks. She needed to finish the constitutions. She needed to draw up a brief history of the congregation from its beginning, with a detailed report on its present state, spiritual and financial. She needed to outline plans for its immediate future. All these things would have to be discussed and examined in detail by the chapter. On 15th of August 1867, the first general chapter was opened by Father Favre. As president of the chapter, he led the prayers and called upon the first speaker, Mother Mary of the Heart of Jesus, to give her report. While Euphrasie was reading, the sisters were marvelling, though they knew the story well. They followed it once more, from its beginning exactly 6 years ago, when 2 young sisters had come to the little borrowed apartment in Lyon, to this day, when they sat in the big new convent holding their first general chapter. Now there were 35 sisters living in the mother house, most of them novices and postulants, and 18 orphans. There were another 5 sisters recently professed, and at this moment packing to go to New Zealand. 4 were already in New Zealand, and 3 in Sydney. Euphrasie had made a final decision. As she finished reading, she left her place and handed the President her report, her registers, and the official seal. Kneeling down in the open space before his table, she asked pardon for all the faults of her leadership. Father Favre declared her now free of all further responsibility for the congregation. Rising from her knees, she turned and walked to the far end of the room and sat down on an empty chair. Now she was free. For the rest of the meeting she could listen and speak, but from this evening she was no more responsible for the congregation than any other person in the room. The next morning the sisters assembled in the chapel to vote for their new leader. They prayed solemnly. In silence, each wrote the name of her choice on a slip of paper, folded it, and dropped it into a deep bowl standing on a small table in the middle of the chapter. The first vote was opened and read aloud. Mother Mary of the Heart of Jesus. Euphrasie was visibly startled. One by one, the papers were lifted out, unfolded, and read. Every paper but one bore the same name, Mother Mary of the Heart of Jesus. Euphrasie was shocked. In the hush after the final reading, she stood up. Reverend Father President, sisters, I beg of you to excuse me from this responsibility. I have been long enough, too long already. It is not good. Father Favre was waiting for her first pause, and he was adamant. Reverend Mother Mary of the Heart of Jesus, your re-election is perfectly valid according to the constitutions. A renewal of appointment is permissible. It is also the unanimous wish of your sisters. It is therefore the call of God, and you cannot refuse it without serious reason. Euphrasie stood silent. The sisters sat motionless, with eyes closed or looking down at the floor. Only Father Favre gazed directly at Euphrasie. At last, she too bowed her head. I accept, she said quietly. There was a sigh of relief from the sisters. Euphrasie tried to push away her disappointment. In so short a time, her freedom had come and had gone. If it is God's will, then, I shall do it gladly, she tried to tell herself over and over again. At Father Favre's sign, she held up her head and walked back to the Superior General's seat. The discussions in chapter showed how much she still had to do. Most importantly, everyone decided she must go to Rome as soon as possible to get official approval of the congregation and its constitutions. The chapter also strongly recommended that she personally accompany the next lot of sisters to Oceania, where the pioneers were working, and also visit the sisters in New Zealand and Australia. News came back from the sisters in Sydney. They were very tired from their trip, some of it hard sailing, but the Marist fathers had given them the warmest of welcomes. Sister Wilfred, Euphrasie's partner from the first day of the congregation, had been put in charge of the Sydney convent. She was the kindest and gentlest of sisters, scrupulously good and loved by everyone, but Sydney terrified her. The plans made so carefully in France would fit none of Sydney's realities. She was almost paralysed with scruples. She had promised to observe all the rules faithfully, and she could not reconcile the informality and unexpected demands of colonial life with her own ideas of good religious observance. Try as she might, she could not model the tiny Sydney community on the pattern of the large and orderly mother house with its well-established customs and regular routine. To make matters worse, Father Pupinel wanted a boarding school immediately, but Sister Mary Frances de Sales fell seriously ill, and Sister Mary Peter could scarcely speak English. Worst of all her problems, a letter to the mother house requesting advice or authorization to change plans took weeks to reach France, and the reply would take as long to come back. Euphrasie wrote cheery letters to reassure the Sydney sisters. By all means open the school. Help one another. The mother house is our model, but there will always be times when we cannot do everything just as we would wish. We remember what we ought to do and work towards it. Make a beginning, and next year we'll try to send an English sister to help you. The next letter from Sydney was from Father Pupinel. The school he wanted was still not opened, and he was becoming impatient. This time Euphrasie wrote to each of the sisters separately. She encouraged Sister Wilfrid. She told Sister Mary Peter to get the school started immediately as best she could. She wrote to Sister Mary of Mercy, the pioneer novice, who doubted the validity of her novitiate. Such were Sister Wilfrid's scruples about their community life. Within weeks another letter arrived from Father Pupinel, suggesting that the novice Sister Mary of Mercy be appointed superior the moment she made her vows. He had no faith whatever in the others, one sick, another French, and the third unable to make up her mind. Euphrasie was alarmed and tried to pacify him. "Let's wait," she wrote, "and next month I hope to have some good news for you." She had scarcely posted the letter when another came from Father Pupinel. He had already put his scheme into practice. The novice had been professed and was now superior. The sick sister was on a boat for France. Sister Mary Peter had been sent to New Zealand, and Sister Wilfrid he totally ignored. "I have yielded to necessity," he explained briefly to Euphrasie. Euphrasie wrote another tactful letter, hoping to quieten things down until she could visit Sydney herself, perhaps in a few months. To Sister Wilfrid she wrote, "If you have to leave Sydney in the meantime, come back to France." Euphrasie consulted Father Favre. He was puzzled by Father Pupinel's actions. "He knows that we Marists have no authority over the sisters," he said. "Yes, Reverend Mother, you must go with your next lot of sisters and settle them in yourself. On the other hand, with all this trouble in Sydney, your visit could be resented and create an explosive situation." He paced up and down the room, frowning. "What about going to Rome immediately to get approval of your congregation and its constitutions? That would be the best safeguard for your sister's independence." Other trusted friends in the church gave similar advice. "Your mother house community is very young. It would not be wise to leave it so long just yet. A trip to Oceania could take several years. If your constitutions were officially approved by the Church, your congregation would be in a stronger position. If you were approved, you could more easily get advice and help. Before planning a trip to Rome, Euphrasie set off for Gravesend with the 5 new missionaries to join the 4 already in New Zealand. 2 were to join the Napier community, and 3 were for a new foundation in Christchurch in the South Island. Returning to the mother house, Euphrasie promptly posted a cheering letter to them all in Sydney, where they were to stay for a short time, and in the new year another to Christchurch to welcome them to their new mission. It was some months before their reply reached the mother house to startle and amuse the sisters at home. In February, the missionaries had finally reached Lyttelton Harbour. No one was there to meet them, and a bitterly cold rain was pouring down, though the season was actually summer. A kind woman helped the sisters to reach the town, and they found their way on foot to the Catholic mission. The parish priest gaped at them in amazement as they stood on his doorstep. He stared at the black habits edged in blue. "Sisters?" "No, not our sisters," he said. "I am expecting some sisters from Sydney next month, but not your sisters. Our sisters wear a bright blue habit. They will have come from France. Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions, they are called." It took some time to convince him that his information had somehow been muddled. Overcome by confusion at his embarrassing mistake, and by now running late for the scheduled Sunday Mass, he begged the sisters' forgiveness and hurried them over to the church. "You are most welcome, he said. "Come, later, we will attend to you properly. Come, sisters." In his haste and embarrassment, he failed to notice that the travellers' clothing was drenched. Wet to the skin and faint with cold, weariness and hunger, for they had eaten nothing since the previous day, they followed him into the church, and in a daze stumbled into the pew he indicated. Numbly, they tried to pray through the long ritual of a high mass. As in a dream, they heard their new pastor speaking words of welcome from the pulpit and presenting them to his parishioners. At the end of Mass, they soon discovered the reality of that welcome. "Sisters, your house is not quite finished. I am sorry for that, but you must stay here. You must have my house until yours is ready. These good people will help me move out and prepare." And the parishioners standing around nodded eagerly in agreement. The sisters were taken aback. They had expected to find their appointed Reverend Mother, one of the experienced missionaries from Napier, waiting here to introduce them to their new home. They did not know that at this moment she was still in Napier, quite unaware of her new appointment. Several months now after its posting from the mother house, the letter of notification had not yet reached her. Sister Mary Joseph, the eldest of the travellers, and their temporary leader, spoke for the group. "We thank you, Reverend Father, for your kindness, but if it is at all possible, we would prefer to move at once into our own place, even if it is not finished. Is it possible?" And she smiled. Father Chaitanya nodded and reluctantly led the way to the new house. Scaffolding stood in every room, and most of the doors and windows were gaping spaces. There was no dismay on the sisters' faces. They smiled around at the embarrassed priest and his flock. Had they not coped with this kind of problem many times before in the early days at the mother house? Within an hour, the newcomers discovered the kindness and generosity of their hosts. Father Chaitanya and the men of the parish streamed in and out of the little house, carrying chairs, tables, beds, and pieces of kitchenware, most of them coming from the priest's own house. Provisions, too, came from Father's larder, and more from parishioners who had taken to heart Father's words at Mass that morning. One woman came to the door with a good joint of meat. "I'll bring you a bit from time to time," she promised. Others came with smaller offerings, a little fresh milk, some butter, bread, home-grown fruit and vegetables, a few cakes or cookies fresh from the oven. The generous proprietor of a flourishing furniture shop came with his wife to see what the sisters' house still lacked. By nightfall, the little house was well set up, if still unfinished, and the sisters were exhausted. "And don't worry if you hear noises outside in the night," explained one of the men as they prepared to leave. "We'll be back after dark to take turns guarding the house. We'll do that every night until the carpenters get locks onto the doors and windows, and Father will be taking a turn too." The sisters slept fitfully that night, tired out from their travels and the long day's efforts, but disturbed by the strangeness of their surroundings and the unexpected challenges they had already met. Sister Mary Joseph was coughing badly, and none of them felt really well, but they were determined to send a cheerful and amusing account of their adventures to the mother house. By New Year, there were 30 novices in the mother house, and they promised prayers and sacrifices every day for the success of the trip to Rome. Euphrasie set off with Mother Jude, one of her counsellors. With them, they had letters of introduction to people who could help them in Rome. "Go first to Cardinal Barnabo," Father Favre had said. "He is an old friend of mine. No one could be kinder or more helpful, and I have already told him about you several times." On their first day in the strange city, the two sisters called on Cardinal Barnabo. To Euphrasie's dismay, the busy man seemed quite at a loss. "Mother Mary of the Heart of Jesus?" he queried. "Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions? From Father Favre? Ah, yes, I know good Father Favre very well, but I do not recollect." Fortunately, Euphrasie had brought all her important documents, including the change of obedience, which had authorized her to leave the Sisters of Compassion. The Cardinal took them all for further examination and arranged another appointment. The second meeting was far more encouraging. "I have had another letter from Father Favre," said the Cardinal cheerfully. "Now I remember. Now I know what to do." The kind old man arranged for the sisters to have an audience with the Pope, who spoke to Euphrasie for some minutes about her new congregation and its aims. While their business was under scrutiny in the Roman offices, Euphrasie and Mother Jude had time to visit St. Peter's and various ancient shrines. They wrote enthusiastic letters to the mother house, telling of their wonderful experiences. Letters from home, though, were not so happy. Young Sister Mary John had been ill when Euphrasie was leaving the mother house. Now she had taken a turn for the worse and was not expected to recover. Euphrasie wrote a quick note to her, but before it reached Leon, Sister Mary John was dead. Sister Mary of Compassion, who had been left in charge of the mother house, was now dying of a lingering illness. Word came from New Zealand that one of the missionaries there was also terminally ill. There was other sad news too. Father Philpin wrote from London to tell Euphrasie that her old community, the Sisters of Compassion, were having a bad time. After years of instability and conflict, dating back to her own time with them, they had finally broken with the Oratorian Fathers and gone back to their original Servite affiliation as at Couve. Consequently, they had been forced to move out of St. Wilfrid's convent and make a completely new start. Mother St. John had left them in undeserved disgrace and had recently died as a humble lay sister in another congregation in Paris. Euphrasie's heart ached for them. They had been so long a part of her life and had remained such true friends that their hurts were like a blow to herself. News from the Barbiers was disturbing too. Naomi's husband, still a young man, was incurably ill with tuberculosis, and the whole family was anxious about him. When a black-edged letter arrived one day in March, its bad news was something Euphrasie would never have expected. Louis, dear kind Papa, was dead of a sudden heart attack. Heartbroken, Euphrasie wrote promptly and bravely to her distressed mother. Alone, she wept in her room. If only I could have been there. If only I could see Papa just once more. If only I could hold Mama. She remembered Papa's quiet smiles at her last visit, and the loving grip of his tired old hands at their parting hug. She had known that he was ailing, but he was always so cheerful and busy that she had never suspected that they were saying goodbye forever. Euphrasie prayed and wept, but the tears had to be wiped away quickly. There was urgent business to do. For the present, her work in Rome was done. Leaving all her documents for further examination, she set off for the mother house. She could not have or give the comfort of a visit to her family yet. Knowing that she would soon be wanted in Rome again, she had urgent business to attend to in the mother house community. Just after Easter, the Barbiers wrote again. This time Adele had had a nasty accident and was still in shock. In trying to protect her cat from a stray dog, she had been badly bitten on the hand. The doctor had performed a cauterization, the cleaning out of the wound by a red-hot iron, the usual treatment for the bite of an animal with rabies. The letter hastened to reassure Euphrasie that a post-mortem on the dog had shown no symptoms of rabies. The cauterization had been repeated a week later because the wounds were not healing well, but after these dreadful ordeals, Adele seemed to be on the way to recovering her usual good health. So don't worry, the letter ended with the usual loving wishes. 2 months later, a short letter arrived from Adele. She had written it sitting up in a hospital bed. The scars on her hand were now faint and perfectly healed, But the previous day she had developed a fever with some pain and stiffness, and odd little muscular spasms. The doctor was alarmed and put her into hospital as a precautionary measure. "Don't worry about me," she wrote. "I'm much better today. Out of danger, they say. They're all so good to me, but what a fuss. I hope they'll let me go home tomorrow." Her letter went to the post, but the next morning the symptoms returned, and Adele was racked by violent convulsions. They were the unmistakable symptoms of rabies. In her lucid moments, Adele sat upright in bed, clutching the blanket to her mouth and signing to her children to stand back from her. Even in her seizures, her concern was all for them. She feared that, like a rabid animal, she might involuntarily bite those she loved and so infect them. When Euphrasie opened and read her mother's cheerful little letter in Lyon, she had no idea that her mother was already lying dead in Caen. When a second letter arrived soon after her mother's, she could hardly believe its sad news. Her mother's note still lay on the desk beside her, waiting to be answered. Euphrasie picked up that little note and kissed it, folded it, and placed it carefully under the crucifix standing on her desk. Dazed, she went to find Sister Mary of the Immaculate Heart, her sister Marie. Poor Marie. Perhaps she will feel it more than any of us, she thought. She was the baby, their darling, at home for so long after the rest of us had grown up. Secretly, Marie was more distressed than Euphrasie ever knew. She had been finding religious life particularly difficult and could confide in no one. Everyone expected her to relish it. After all, she was Reverend Mother's own sister. Marie resented that people presumed she thought and felt like Euphrasie, that the congregation was the absorbing interest of her life, that her enthusiasm and devotion enabled her to bear sufferings with indifference and even joy, as the self-possessed little Reverend Mother appeared to do. Marie resented even the similarity of their religious names. "We must hurry to Caen to help them fix up family business," Euphrasie said. "Louis and Naomi are begging us to come soon." Marie prepared silently. She could not talk to Euphrasie. Euphrasie did not seem like a sister. She was kind and concerned, but Marie could not remember her as one of the family. She had always been a godlike figure, a rare and exotic visitor to be revered and deferred to. In the convent she was a figurehead too, Reverend Mother General, and everyone seemed to acknowledge her superiority in all matters, spiritual and temporal. Marie could not imagine Euphrasie ever feeling as disheartened or homesick or depressed as herself. Euphrasie too was finding life hard in spite of her congregation's big gains. It seemed that every hard-earned step forward was countered by some unexpected pain or loss. One day, the first document of approval arrived from Rome. It was dated 9th of June, the day after her mother's death. In a moment of discouragement, Euphrasie found herself asking, "Must we always pay like this for gifts from God?" Retiring to her room, she caught sight again of that last note from her mother, lying folded under the crucifix. It had become a precious relic, a bond with two wonderful parents now gone, and she often reread it with love and prayers and tears. In fact, she still could not think or speak of Adele without being overwhelmed with tears. She unfolded the paper and kissed it once more, and began to read, wiping away the tears which blurred the cheerful words. This time she did not refold the letter. I must let Mamma go, she told herself. I want to keep this. There is no harm in that, but I must let her go. I must do it for him, and I will offer it up for Mamma. She tore the letter into small pieces and quickly slid them into the flames in the fireplace. Official church approval was a welcome pledge of security for the congregation. But when Euphrasie read through her papers returned from Rome, she was surprised and disappointed by some of the amendments required in the constitutions. The vow of zeal had been deleted from the sisters' form of consecration, and all mention of the divine missions had been removed from the constitutions. There was, moreover, a firm instruction to herself, telling her that spiritual and theological matters were not proper material for constitutions. They could be put into some little pious handbook for personal use later. Euphrasie was quite taken aback. It seemed to her that the divine missions and zeal were the very heart of her sister's religious life, and therefore the core of their constitutions, rather than the external rules and regulations which had been approved without question. Deferring to churchmen seemingly older and wiser than herself, without argument, she put aside the rejected paragraphs, resolving to put them later into a directory for the sisters' use and encouragement. She knew how disappointed they would be not to be allowed to renew their vow of zeal publicly, though they would live it every day and try to spend their whole lives for the divine missions. She did not grumble or complain. It is the will of God now, she kept telling herself firmly, and she savagely closed her mind to further argument. Right now, the hardest thing in the world for her was to give up her own will, but she knew she must do it, not from fear of authority or of the penalties of rebellion, but simply to yield to God the last remnant of resistance in her soul. Giving without reserve was what she called it. The wording of the documents from Rome seemed to suggest that the vow of zeal and the divine missions might be reconsidered some time in the future. But in the meantime, she refused herself the satisfaction of arguing her case, even in her mind. I have always been naturally willful, right from my childhood, she said to herself. So often I must make decisions, take responsibility, fight against obstacles. Only afterwards do I see that I have stepped over the line between perseverance and willfulness. Now God is asking me to yield, to be totally dependent. It hurt so much to be thwarted in what seemed right, to be turned aside from what seemed best. She stubbornly turned her mind to prayer and to other duties in hand. Death was not the only sorrow that year. Of all the pioneers Euphrasie had been corresponding with, only 3 remained interested in joining the congregation. They were perfectly free to make their choice, it was true, but their decisions were disappointing nonetheless. Far more disappointing, even frightening, was the news that Father Favre was retiring from leadership of the Marist Fathers. He had been such a good friend and adviser that Euphrasie knew she would miss him desperately. Over the years, the Marist fathers had helped her with many loans. Now was the time to finish paying them off, and Euphrasie requested a complete account from them. According to her own careful bookkeeping, she expected the debt to be something like 40,000 francs. To her horror, it was 140,000. She was shocked. How could she have miscalculated so badly? She went at once to see the brother who kept the accounts, and the mystery was solved. He had misread a long list of donations made by parishioners to the sisters as loans made by the Marist fathers. The brother was horribly embarrassed. "I am so sorry, Reverend Mother," he kept saying. "How easily I was making a Marist fortune at your expense. But how can I apologize for the distress I have caused you?" Immensely relieved, Euphrasie tried to cheer him up, but for all their efforts it was still impossible to reconcile the Marist figures with Euphrasie's meticulous bookkeeping. Father Yardin and Father Favre joined in the scrutiny with no more success. With the agreement of his council, Father Favre made one more act of generosity before his retirement. "Mother, the Marist fathers now cancel all your debts, but only on one condition, that every day your sisters pray for the Society of Mary and help their apostolate in any way they can." Euphrasie agreed with all her heart, and hurried home to tell her sisters the good news, resolving that from that very day the Marist fathers would be mentioned by name every time the sisters said the Angelus. She knew that no amount of gratitude could ever repay all that the Marist fathers had done for the founding and the survival of the Mission Sisters.